Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to be taking you through the setup and configuration of a great feature within Dynamics 365, which is the ability to add custom icons within your grid views and your home page grids within the system. So you can see here from the bottom right hand side that I have very specific indicators on my open list of opportunities. And if I hover over those, I can see a little bit more detail of why this icon is presented. I can see at a glance that there is some action that needs to be taken against them. If I navigate through to the main opportunities list here, this image is also represented in the homepage grid. So this feature has been available since the December release of Dynamics 2016. So provided you're on that version or higher, you'll have access to this capability and you'll be able to set up this embedded visualization within home grids and subgrids. So let's walk through basically end to end. How do you configure this? How do you set this up within your system? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is go to the settings area and I'm going to go to solutions. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is go to a solution that I've already pre-configured. Now in your scenario, obviously you would create a new solution and you would start adding in these web resources. Let's talk about these web resources in a little bit more detail. Within the solution I have open now, I have 3 web resources, 1 JavaScript web resource and 2 icon web resources. The icon web resources that you can see here are basically image files that I've uploaded that I want to appear within the opportunity subgrid. So let's just open one here. For this image web resource that I've already uploaded, if I click on preview, I can see the type of icon that's presented. And in this case, this is the critical icon. And the other one is much the same. It's yellow and it basically denotes a warning in this case. So the other web resource is the JavaScript library that controls how the subgrid interacts with data and in which conditions should it return an icon in the column that's configured on. So in this case, I've already got a library set up that's doing the action you saw at the beginning of the video, serving an icon depending on certain conditions. We'll go through that towards the end, but for now, let's go through an end-to-end setup, get a new web resource uploaded to the solution, and let's just start binding that to data in CRM and see what it does. In this case, with web resources, I'm going to simply add a new one, and let's call this sample icon. That's my image web resource configured. Next thing to do is click Save. With that committed, I can go back to my solution. So here's my sample icon that I've chosen. And I can see what that's uploaded simply by hitting the preview. And I can see here that I've got a different type of alert icon up here. So let's close that. I've got an icon within the system. How do I get that into a view? So that what you need for that is a JavaScript library that will tell the view what icon to use in a column. Let's build the JavaScript web resource. So from web resources, let's go to new again. And in this case, I'm going to choose a JavaScript web resource and I'm going to give it a name and fill out the rest of the details. So the next thing I want to do here is basically just add a placeholder within this, because in later versions of Dynamics 365 it doesn't let you save the web resource without any content. Okay, and that's my web resource set up. Now that web resource doesn't have any code in it at the moment, so what I'll do now is I'll switch to Visual Studio so that I can start fleshing out this function a little bit more. And the reason I'm doing that and not doing it in the text editor is simply because I don't hate myself. So here we are in Visual Studio, and the next thing I'm going to do is create a new JavaScript file so that I can start writing some script. I'll select web and go down to the bottom, JavaScript file. So before we write this function, let's talk about what Dynamics 365 expects from this grid view. In order to display an icon, we need to provide the system 2 pieces of information. All this function does is, in a really straightforward basis, is return a string array containing 2 properties. The first property here is a reference and a pointer to the web resource that we want to serve within the grid view. So this says always return a link to the sample icon web resource we set up. The second property is the tooltip that we want displayed to the user once that user hovers over. It's very basic, a single line of code that says show this icon and display this tooltip. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it into my web resource. So now, instead of using the existing to-do block, I'm going to paste that in. And I'm also just going to copy that quickly so that I have it to hand in the clipboard. So I'm going to save it and I'm going to publish it. Okay, so now that's published, I'm going to close the window. And I'm going to go back to the components list within my solution. The next thing I'm going to do is register the function that I've just created to a view within Dynamics 365. So to do that, I'm going to open the opportunity in this case. And I'm going to navigate to views. And in this case, I'm just going to add another view into the mix because the other one I've already pre-configured, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So let's pick another random view that we have on offer to us. Recent opportunities. Why not? So now I have recent opportunities as an asset and a component within my system. So I'm going to double click and I'm going to open this to show the view configuration. Now what I'm presented with here is the standard out of the box configurator. I can do all the awesome stuff like moving things left and right and doing everything like that. For the feature we're talking about today, specifically adding icons into cells within a view of data, this is done by clicking Change Properties once you have a column highlighted. So if I highlight this column, I can click Change Properties, and this brings up the Properties dialog. Prior to Dynamics CRM December update, these options were not available. And this is where we configure what web resource to bind to, and specifically what function in that web resource do I call in order to understand what icons I should be getting back. In this case, I'm going to use the lookup and find my web resource. We'll choose the sample library that we set up, and I'll paste in my little function that we created before. What I'll expect from that is that for every cell in the actual revenue column, my function is going to be called, and it's going to be presented with the sample icon that I created previously and a tooltip that we also set up. I'm going to save and close this, and now I'm going to publish my customizations. Okay. So now, in theory, I can go back to my Dynamics 365 environment, go to the recent opportunities view, and I should see my icon everywhere. So let's navigate back. Let's go to the sales area, go to opportunities. Now this is a previous version, so we don't need to look at that. What we're interested in is recent opportunities. This is the one we've just configured. And there we are. In this view, I've set up a web resource to say always return this icon for each cell. And like I said, that's probably the most basic implementation of this. If you just simply want to categorize or color code records within your views. Now let's do something a little bit more complex to that. Let's actually provide a little bit of insight into the data and provide users with a way of seeing a state of a record based on some business rules. Returning then to Visual Studio, let's create another function that does something a little bit more complex. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to paste in from another resource. And this is an example of a slightly more complex function. The difference here is that we're using data from the row itself and decide which icon to show in certain circumstances. So for the example here, what you'll see is the first line. I'm using a built-in method within the browser to convert the payload of data that's issued to this function into a workable object within JavaScript. So the parameters that get passed in here is a data payload in JSON format, and also the language code, the localization for the system user. Now that I've got that converted into a JavaScript object, I can access that a little bit better and start building up some logic around it. What I'm essentially doing here is first checking that the data contains the element in which I expect, and in this case it's the estimated close date. So that column needs to exist within the view that this is attached to. Then I'm declaring a new date object. Then I'm doing two pieces of logic. I'm saying to the system, if the estimated close date less than or equal to today, then that opportunity has elapsed and I want to show a critical icon to the user. However, if the date hasn't elapsed, the next thing I'm doing is checking if that date is within 2 days of today. If it is 2 days from today, I simply display a warning icon instead. So apart from a few JavaScript quirks in terms of how it uses date times and the format which Dynamics CRM provides it, all this function really does is decide whether or not the opportunity is in a critical state or whether or not the opportunity is in a warning state based on its estimated close date from today. What we need to do now is go back to the web resource and go back to our solution and bind the column to our new function. So here I have my solution, and I'm going to go back to opportunity, and I'm going to go back to the view that we configured previously, and this time, instead of telling it to look at the demo function we set it before, I'm going to tell it to look at, in fact, I'm going to set it up on a new column just so that we can see both in parallel. So I'm going to select the web resource that I want, and I'm going to paste in my function from the JavaScript library. Then I'm going to save, and then I'm going to publish. Then I'm going to refresh my view. So your first impression here is that it didn't work at all. If I resort this by the estimated close date, you can see that some of these icons have actually filtered through. The reason being is the way the view was sorted to begin with is that all of the future opportunities were there and listed at the top. Now that I've resorted it so that some of the closer and more overdue ones are present, we can see this icon taking effect. And we can see here if we hover over, it'll tell me whether or not it's overdue or if there's more of a critical warning, something like that. Now, a bit of a weird use case, sure, because actual close date is also present here. But the key thing here is basically just an example. How do we set up an icon within Dynamics 365 to appear within grid views? But then, more critically, how do we drive that from business logic within the system so that we're actually getting some insight into the data and we're actually getting some benefit from this? It's all well and good setting up an icon just to display against cells of data within your system, but you really want it to drive a business benefit. So the more logic you have behind this, the more return you're going to get from this configuration. So just to recap, let's go over all of those steps end to end again, just in a quick summary. So to implement icons within your data grids, you need a JavaScript function within a web resource to return to the platform which icon to display and what tooltip to show the user if that icon is displayed. You also need to upload the actual icons themselves as image web resources. The function that you configure needs to return a string array. The first element in that array should be the schema name of the icon web resource, and the second element in that string array should be the plain text tooltip that you're going to use. With your function defined, you then need to register it on the view in which you want these icons to display. To register a web resource, you need to select the column that you want to configure it for, click Change Properties, select the web resource, and select the function which will control the response. So with those steps taken, this is how we can configure icons to show within static data grids within Dynamics 365. If you want a more complex version of this as well, so you can see, for example, in my function here, I'm not using the language code at all. You can configure these to be more complex to return different language variants for each user. I'm not going to go into that example here, but if you go back to my blog, which the link is in the description, there's an example of that code there as well, where you can have a dictionary of translations, and depending on the language code that's passed in from the platform, you can configure the response to be more appropriate to that user. So with that, thank you very much for stopping by, and I hope this helps.